Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. We do want to continue on with our top stories that we're following. And this next one takes us to the world of technology. I do want to put up this live vantage point that we have there at the White House. And so you may have seen this article and this headline come across your news feed. But artificial intelligence firm Anthropic is now suing the Trump administration this week over the Pentagon's choice to designate it as a supply chain risk. According to some of those legal findings, Anthropic is now alleging that the federal government retaliated against the company over its opposition to the use of its AI for lethal autonomous warfare or mass surveillance of Americans. And so their two sides have become increasingly contentious in these conversations over those limitations for months, according to our partners there at Reuters. President Trump also said in a social media post that ordered the entire government to stop using Claude. To talk a lot more about how we arrived at this point, I do want to now bring into the conversation Mark Beall. He's the president of government affairs for the AI Policy Network and former Pentagon AI Policy Director. Mark, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Hello.
All right, there's a lot to uncover when we're talking about a story like this, many different layers that has a lot of folks questioning how we got to this point. And so for the average American who may use ChatGPT pretty irregularly or just to ask a question or two, they might be wondering why the government and the Pentagon has such intense interest in that technology overall. Can you sort of walk us through that conversation and how that happens on Capitol Hill and the use of that technology?
Sure. Well, everything sort of begins with the invention of a technique called deep learning. And what that did was it allowed AI products to start to become very commercially useful for all kinds of different enterprises, for healthcare, for marketing, for government. And I think during the first Trump administration, there was a recognition that AI was going to be disrupting the world, transforming the world, and that the U.S. government had to get its arms around it. So flash forward to today, we've seen this very sort of predictable trend in AI capabilities getting more and more and more powerful. And government agencies and leaders are looking at this technology and seeing a tremendous opportunity to improve the operational effectiveness and efficacy of government operations. And so they're looking at this as a way to increase value for taxpayers, to do things better, faster, and more efficiently. And as a result, there's this sort of all-out blitz across not just government, but private industry on figuring out how it is that these organizations can adopt and use AI for the betterment of whatever it is that they're trying to do in the world.
And now we've gotten to a point where we're seeing some controversy involved with that. Putting this up from the New York Post, as the Pentagon has now labeled Anthropic as a supply chain risk just days after the CEO clashed with President Trump. I do have to ask you, when it comes to these policy decisions and what government contracts are ultimately given out, how does that conversation work behind the scenes as you were in the Pentagon at a point where able to sort of discuss how the policy and the technology would merge together?
Yeah, everything begins in the government with what they call a requirement. So what is it the government needs to do with a certain acquisition? And once that's written down, from there what happens is that requirement gets published in the public, and then companies bid to provide their services, their products to service that requirement. And then at the end of the day, a contracting team chooses which company or companies get selected, and then they're off to the races. And as part of this negotiation, things like terms of use and any limitations and guardrails are typically negotiated behind closed doors. And companies ranging, from missile providers to technology providers, frequently have information they share with the government that says, well, here's an area where we think this might not be a good idea to use it, and the government can push back, and there's a little bit of a back and forth to try to figure out what the actual use case needs to look like. And so what happened with Anthropic, as far as we can tell, and to be clear, there's not a lot of publicly available specific information about this, but the Pentagon and Anthropic came to a little bit of a loggerheads over two fundamental disagreements. The first was whether or not Anthropic's AI tool called Claude could be permissible and used for lethal autonomous military applications, so basically killer robots. And then on the other side is whether or not the DoD could use Claude to analyze domestic data on American citizens and use that to draw insights for a variety of things. This is what the conversation has been over the last couple of months behind the scenes, and that's kind of all now blown all the way up with the president getting involved and now this designation.
Absolutely. And so as we're even talking about how AI could potentially be used in warfare, also putting up some video on your screen that we have of the current conflict there in Iran. And so, as we're talking about Anthropic, they say that there are two major issues, you just mentioned them there, are the fact that AI can be used for autonomous warfare and surveillance of Americans. Can you further break down why the company had these concerns and ultimately what that means as far as you said, you called them killer robots? In layman's terms, in a sense, does this mean that the AI is then sort of operating on its own in order to strike targets that the government may be trying to program it to do?
So I think in this case, there are two very important things for folks to understand. The first is the Department of War has every right to establish defense policy for itself. The only really institutional authority that can curb what the Pentagon does is the United States Congress. And so the DoD folks are, I think, rightfully concerned about any limitations that are applied on their activities from the outside. But I also think Anthropic is onto something, because what they're telling the Pentagon is that, look, our capabilities are not yet safe and reliable and effective for very high consequence activities like combat operations. And by the way, we don't think U.S. law has kept up with the type of technology that exists today when it comes to the privacy of American citizens. And so Anthropic as a company had some deep reservations about the technical and appropriateness of using their tools in some of these cases. And I think the Pentagon also rightfully saw that it could not be impeded to act in accordance with its own interests by a private company. I think this is why I think Congress needs to step in and play a constructive role. What needs to happen is we very much need to de-escalate this situation. The relationship between the national security community and the AI companies is very strategic and critical for the future of American foreign policy and national security and economic competitiveness. And this is perhaps the most consequential AI policy moment that we've had so far. And so where Congress can play a constructive role is helping to sort of articulate what those guardrails need to look like when it comes to killer robots. And then it could also, I think, appropriately update some of our domestic privacy laws to ensure that things like the Fourth Amendment are preserved in an era in which we have ubiquitous data and ubiquitous AI capabilities that government agencies can have access to.
It'll be interesting as we're watching all of this unfold to see if Congress does decide to make any laws or changes there as well. And so, Mark, also, I want to focus on this. We do know that there is now OpenAI who's trying to step into that slot that Anthropic is now leaving behind, as they are now suing the Pentagon over this Lewis label and some of how that relationship ultimately soured. Can we sort of think about possibly the difference between what OpenAI is being offered in a government contract versus the deal that was put on the table with Anthropic?
Yeah, it's a great question. Candidly, I don't think anyone from the outside quite knows fully the details of those two contracts. Because if you read what OpenAI has put out about that contract in the media, it looks like it starts to address some of the concerns that Anthropic has. But maybe there are some technical shortfalls or some practical shortfalls. In fact, I think what we've seen in the last 24 hours is an amicus brief filed by a number of Google and OpenAI employees that have sort of signaled their concern with the direction all of this is headed, and just underscoring the fact that we may or may not want to have AI doing autonomous targeting of military purposes. But right now, regardless of whether we want that, the technology is not safe and it is not guaranteed to remain under human control if we were to do this right now. So this is very much a fluid and evolving situation. We just continue to hope that cooler heads can prevail and we can work this out and figure out the right policy that serves the interests of the United States.
Lastly, before I let you go, Mark, I do want to ask you this. When we're thinking about the United States and the role that it's now playing in some of our military operations and what it has access to overall, are there any other countries out there who potentially have similar policies and ongoing defense contracts where they're also using artificial intelligence to be able to do autonomous drone strikes? Or is that something that we're more focused on here in the U.S.?
I think there are certainly appetites among some of our most strategic competitors for increasing AI-enabled military capabilities. And I'm thinking specifically about the People's Republic of China. We already know, based on open source information, that China has used American AI chips to train certain types of capabilities and targeting systems for their anti-ship ballistic missile systems that are going to target U.S. aircraft carriers. Everyone has recognized, military or civilian, that AI can accelerate decision cycles, can help extract very specific amounts of data and large data sets, and just facilitate overall velocity when it comes to whatever undertaking that the organization is pursuing. So I think we should expect that AI will become even more dominant as a force in military activities and in global security. And these questions are only going to become more urgent and more dangerous over time as these systems get more and more powerful.
Still so much to uncover as we're still continuing to follow this top story. We certainly appreciate Mark Beall for joining us here on Live Now from Fox, as we do know that Anthropic is now suing the Pentagon over this supply chain risk label, ultimately all tying into warfare. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you.